Center for Learning, Innovation and Customized Knowledge Solutions. Narimane, you're very welcome.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. One of the challenging things about being the last is that everybody's tired. So no matter what I say, it's not going to matter. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and David for having me here. And I probably will go one step before what Professor Lotfi was talking about. Prof. Lotfi has shared with us a very good example of actually what they are doing within their institution in terms of implementing SDGs. And I would like to share more of a framework on what is it that universities could actually be doing in terms of embracing SDGs. What are the global developments that are happening? Because it's not something new. Many institutions have been doing this for a while. So what I'm hoping that we answer within this presentation is talking about what are the SDGs and what does higher education have, what does higher education do in terms of supporting the SDGs? Where can universities contribute the most? How a system approach can be adopted? What global efforts exist in terms of supporting the integration of SDGs, and what strategies will enable a wider embracement of the Sustainable Development Goals? Now, sorry. Okay. So if we come back to this concept of Sustainable Development Goals, are those goals that was launched in 2015 as a continuation of the Millennium Development Goals. They are more of goals, priorities, and aspirations that governments has decided to take forward in order to solve some of the world's most pressing issues around poverty and inclusion, around sustainable environment, around creating, fostering good governance that will allow countries to prosper and so forth. So those 17 Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by 193 countries and regions, and they include around 169 indicators and 223 unique targets. The key question is that from among all these Sustainable Development Goals, which one are more relevant to the higher education sector? And why we immediately relate to SDG 4, which is quality of education. We basically, as university, have a key role in supporting all of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that Professor Lotfi has given us an idea about what universities can do. So ensuring the inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning for all is one of the key things that universities have as a role, as a pivotal role. Obviously, one of the complexities of the SDGs is these interlinks that exist between the social cultural aspect, the environmental aspect, and the economical aspect. And these are very challenging to address. So when universities are really thinking about embracing the SDGs, they have to think about the complexity of the interlink between the 17 SDGs. I think that what we need to ask ourselves primarily is how can universities contribute to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goals? What is the role that universities play today in the 21st century? If we wanted to summarize the role of universities in 5 key roles or 5 areas, we'll say that the first thing is that we have as university a teaching role. So we're responsible for developing and equipping the next generation of sustainability leaders and implementers with the kind of knowledge and essential skills and abilities that they will require to be able to lead the agenda of the SDG until 2030. We also have an advocating role where higher education institutions really need to be the ongoing voice of advocating the importance of the implementation of these goals. We have a social responsibility towards helping the wider community understand and acquire the sort of competencies that are needed in order to achieve the SDGs. We also, as universities, and have a role, or we have a role of disseminating and creating knowledge. So universities, for most of them, drive research, innovation, discovery, knowledge, and dissemination. And part of what we're really looking at is how do we map our research priorities against the SDGs? How can we support, through the research that we do, a solution and innovations to address the problems that are highlighted by the Sustainable Development Goals? How can we produce research and studies that will inform policymakers in relation to how, at a national level, would they tackle the Sustainable Development Goals? So we play a crucial role in doing that. We also play a very crucial role in measuring and evaluating the effect of different countries related to SDG. And obviously, at the heart of the SDGs is this notion of partnership, of cross-sectoral partnership. And as universities, we really play an important role in ensuring that we can forge and establish partnerships, not only within the sector, but across the sector. I think that Professor Lutfi has shared actually this role, where we can see that the relationship between universities and SDGs is a two-way role. Just like universities basically will help the achievement of the SDGs through the 5 roles that they actually play, and also through embracing the concepts and principles of SDGs within their operations, within their structures, within their policies. Universities can also benefit from the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a two-way thing. How can they benefit from the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, basically, the first thing, we're talking a lot about rethinking the role of universities, looking at universities as responsible universities that are supporting or looking at becoming more responsive to social needs and to become agents of change towards solving global challenges. So the SDGs really provides a framework for institutions to rethink their role, to be more prominent and more impactful. We also, higher education institutions also can demonstrate the impact that their institution is having to governments, to external stakeholders, to funders, to the wider community. So by embracing the SDG and mapping what they do against the SDG, they can actually show the impact that they are creating. They can also benefit, institutions of universities and colleges across the globe can also benefit from accessing new funding streams. So we find out that there are many organizations globally that are funding projects supporting SDGs, and these could actually be an opportunity for universities to benefit from this funding. We also see that institutions would have an opportunity to establish new cross-disciplinary partnership. And again, the SDG can act as a framework where organizations can connect and work together. So this will really give the universities the opportunity not just to work within the sector, but across the sector. And obviously, as there is more and more government, business interest and focus on sustainable development goals, there's going to be a need in a raising or an increasing need in graduates who understand and can implement the SDG agenda. That's why many institutions have embraced the integration of SDG within their curriculum by either having compulsory courses that are taught during the first year for students, or having optional awareness campaigns and courses for students around sustainable development goals. So it's becoming really integrated within the curriculum, within the pedagogy, within the teaching and learning practices. So this brings us to the question on what is education for sustainable development? How does it look like? ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development, is really about having students and learners of all ages, with equipping the students of all ages with the knowledge, the skills, the values, and the agency to address the interconnected global challenges that we face. So it's really not about the knowledge acquisition as much as it is about the kind of skills and competencies that they need that they will have to basically do something with the knowledge that they have. And we're really looking at, when we talk about sustainable development education, we're talking at really at looking at lifelong learning at the core or as an integral part of the quality education. So we're looking at developing students as lifelong learners. That implies what? It implies that we need to make learning more meaningful. We need to make our curriculum more meaningful. We need to make our teaching and learning pedagogies more meaningful so that we can address these complex challenges. Now, knowledge and understanding and the kind of skills that students will need to address the SDGs and the quality the indicator within the SDGs will require a set of skills which is quite unique. We're looking at equipping students with critical thinking skills, and I was having a conversation with one of our colleagues here about that. We're looking at motivation, we're looking at sustainability values, attitudes, and behavior, something that Professor Lutfi was talking about later on. We're looking at system thinking. So how do we build up these skills among our students, among our graduates, among our faculty, and among the wider community as a whole? For those higher education institutions that are basically wanting to implement educational for sustainable development, it really often implies a re-engineering of their educational system, following an institutional-wide approach to embracing SDG. UNESCO has identified action plans, which are 5 priority action areas for learning environments in order to embrace the education for sustainable development. That includes working on the policy agenda, that we are going to need policies are instrumental in increasing and enabling environments for successful scaling up of ESDs. So there's a need to work at the policy level on this matter. There is also another key priority around transformational learning environment. How do we transform our learning environments to embrace the principles of SDG? And that is across the spectrum, not just in the classroom and what the faculty does with this, but even what your student services would be doing with your students in terms of learning activities and so forth. There's also a priority around building capacity among students, among faculty, among administrators, and the wider community. And obviously, empowering and mobilizing youth. And it was very interesting to know what the British University in Egypt is doing in terms of engaging students and mobilizing students, giving students a voice in actually implementing the sustainable development goals. And then obviously the last priority is really about creating these links with the community. So how much within the framework of our institutions do we embrace these 5 priorities? And again, whenever we're talking about education for sustainable development, we very often talk about implementing these principles of ESD within the curriculum in an interdisciplinary and holistic manner. So we've seen many institutions either making a course on sustainability compulsory for their students. We've seen institutions like, for instance, Penn State University that integrates sustainability within the weekly study plans of students so that they can address this. We've seen universities starting bachelor's degrees in sustainable development, like Bath University here, or universities starting a professional doctorate in actually sustainable development. So there's really this thing of embracing SDGs within the curriculum. We also look at sharing values and principles that underpin sustainable development. And that, I think, comes back to this concept of identity, promoting complex skills like critical thinking, problem solving, employing a variety of educational methods. How are the SDGs reflected in our teaching and learning practices? Often implies that we need to embrace new pedagogical methods. We talk about experimental learning, about project-based learning, about preparing students for the workplace. And that means that we need to change probably the way we teach within our classes. It also gets students involved more in decision-making related to programs, but also related to the implementation of SDGs, addressing local as well as global issues, and now obviously building capacity and looking at the future. So if we thought about the 3 core functions of our university, which is teaching and learning, research, and community engagement, within all these 3 dimensions, we could integrate SDGs. But in addition to these 3 dimensions, we could also integrate SDG in our day-to-day work, within our own operations, within our own structure, within our own policies, within our own governance arrangements. We could be embracing this. So if we just wanted to think about a framework, what sort of things could we be doing in each one of these areas to support the Sustainable Development Goals? And obviously, I'm not going to read through all these slides. I'm not even sure if it's readable or no. But if we looked at the learning and teaching function, and how is learning and teaching relevant to SDG? There's a whole range of things that universities could be doing in supporting sustainable development goals. If we looked very specifically to goal 4 and the indicator on quality education, we're talking about providing equal access. We heard about access today, affordable and quality technical and vocational education. We're talking about equipping students with relevant skills. We're talking about basically upgrading the facilities to include students with special needs. We're talking about increasing the supply of qualified teachers and so forth. So what can we do in terms of teaching and learning to meet these targets of the SDGs? Universities can start by providing students with an understanding of the SDGs, cross-cutting skills and key competencies that are related to SDGs. We can start emphasizing on teaching students skills like entrepreneurship and critical thinking and complex problem solving. We can also integrate SDGs in the curriculum, in the research. We could also provide training to people who work on curriculum, course coordinator, program coordinators, faculty members, and so forth. We could engage students in the co-creation of learning. So there's many things that we could be doing. We could also empower and mobilize young students. How do we do that? We could actually give the students the opportunities to be heard and participate in the university governance aspect of SDGs. We could get them to engage in student clubs. We've heard Professor Lotfi talking about clubs that are established specifically to support sustainable development goals. We can encourage students to participate in national and global programs around SDG. We could basically get the students to try to find solutions themselves to some of the complex issues that are addressed by the SDGs. We could also universities can provide in-depth academic vocational training to implement the SDGs. I've worked with many universities who have a program for their faculty member to teach them about SDGs and their implication on teaching and learning and curriculum design. We also could enhance opportunities for capacity building for students and professionals from developing countries to address challenges related to SDGs. So there's a lot of what we might be doing a lot of these things, but we might not explicitly map them against the Sustainable Development Goal. If we came to the function of research, what do universities can do to support SDGs in relation to research? Now, what we can see is that a number of SDGs targets are directly refer to the need for research-related activities as a component or as, if you want, a means of implementation. And if you look at the indicator, there are specific targets for research where universities will need to contribute with research. Most of the time, this research is needed in order to understand the challenges of the SDGs, localize the SDGs to specific countries or region, develop solutions, identify and evaluate different options, and support the operationalization of SDGs. So what you can see, for instance, here is that if you look at SDG 9, there is a need for technical capabilities for industrial sectors in all countries. If you looked at SDG 2, 3, 7, 12, 14, there is actually clear indicator about the need of research for sustainable agriculture, for vaccines, for fisheries management. So institutions, what they can do is that they can map their research agenda against the SDG. They can actually also create incentives for their faculty, for their researchers to actually research in areas of concern to the SDGs. Also looking at researching to address the problems of the Sustainable Development Goals implies very often that we might need a different or a new spectrum of research approaches. We might need to look at the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, and that is basically to in order to address the breadth and the depth of the SDGs. So that is something that institutions might need to facilitate structures for. We also, in terms of research, we can produce research that is informing decision makers. Governments often need data, they need information, and institutions can play a key role in that. We could also support capacity building for developing countries to undertake and use research to support the sustainable development goals. So we could actually see what are we doing in research within our institution, how much of what we do is mapping with the sustainable development goals, what are the gaps, where are the opportunities where we can support the research agenda, where we can support the achievement of SDG. Similarly, if we looked at how do we operate as institutions, our organization, our organizational governance, our culture at a university. Now, obviously, any type of organization will have some impact of how the SDGs are translated and are implemented. So as universities, we actually can map the SDGs in our high-level strategies and policies. Many universities have, as part of their strategic planning, have re-articulated their mission statements to actually refer to SDGs. SDGs are referred in many strategic plans within universities and colleges globally. So we could actually embrace that concept of SDGs. And again, what we could say is that for each one of the 17 SDGs, something of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis can contribute to the achievement of sustainable development goals. If we were, for instance, looking at the only, SDG 1 about no poverty, universities can actually promote an environment of social and governance principles within their institution. Institutions, when we talk about, for instance, no hunger, we could look at universities offering fresh market on campus. We could look at facilitating food production on campus. So this is just, and I would really invite you to read this report because it's a good framework for any institution who is looking at embracing SDGs. What are the sort of things that we can do as part of our day-to-day activities, and how can we align this to the Sustainable Development Goals? And many universities have been doing things that support the SDGs, but they're just not clearly mapped against the sustainable. We've been talking about paperless environments and green campuses for years now, but we probably not explicitly align that to the social development goals. So again, for each one of the areas, again, we could be doing a lot of things within our institutions to create environmentally sustainable campuses. We could do things around using sustainable transportation means for our students. We could be looking at basically how to support a healthy workplace by looking at our policies and procedures for employment. How do we address the gender gap? How do we address the issue of equity in salaries? All of these are things that we do within our institutions, but we might not necessarily map against the SDG. In terms of community engagement and outreach work, again, what can we do as universities to support the Sustainable Development Goals? We could basically strengthen public engagement and participation in addressing SDGs. We've seen many institutions doing summits, developing a free online course to educate people about sustainable development goals. We've seen debates, we've seen working paper series being published. Universities can also initiate and facilitate cross-sectoral dialogues and actions on SDGs. They can play a role in policy development. Again, research that we do can inform policymakers within our countries, within our regions, in terms of how to embrace the Sustainable Development Goals. We can also ensure that the higher education sector is well represented and, in the national strategies and lead the discussions related to SDG. And finally, we can demonstrate university sector commitment to SDGs. And I'll share with you some of the global initiatives around commitment to sustainable development goals. There are many coalitions, many initiatives that took place. Now, if we were to look at a framework, at a simple framework on how can we effectively integrate SDGs within our universities, this is simply the steps that we could be looking at. The first thing is the issue of recognition. Identify and acknowledge what the university is already doing and how does this map against the SDGs. So that would be really the first step on knowing what we do and seeing how does it map with the Sustainable Development Goals. Once we've done that, we will probably look at what are the opportunities, where are the gaps, what are the opportunities, what are the areas where given our nature, our identity, we could actually support the SDGs. So probably using a stakeholder approach where we engage different stakeholders and think about the gaps, think about the opportunities that are created, and then identify our priorities, because we're not going to be, not all universities are going to look at all the SDGs with the same level of emphasis and importance. And then obviously we will look at having a more holistic institutional wide approach to sustainability. So many institutions, either as part of their strategic plan or would have a strategy to address sustainable development goals. So, sorry. So universities will be looking at basically a framework very similar to this one. Sorry. So what is happening globally in terms of SDGs and in terms of coalitions and so forth? What we can see is that many universities from across the globe have decided to join the University Global Coalition. It's a declaration that was signed by 100-member institution that demonstrate the commitment of the higher education sector to the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for that. Many institutions have decided to actually join the coalition as a way of showing and demonstrating their commitments to SDGs. We also have a joint statement of global university leaders that was signed back in 2018 in China, and it was signed by 56 presidents from 30 countries and six continents, and that basically demonstrated the commitment of their universities to Sustainable Development Goal. And people or universities that signed this coalition or this joint statement committed to 5 things: to embedding sustainability within their activities at all levels, enhancing the competencies around SDGs, supporting the wider spectrum of research work to SDGs, fostering innovation solutions for sustainable development, and basically leveraging on technology and upholding of open science. So what you can see is that there are many such initiatives, coalitions, declarations that have been signed by leaders of higher education across the globe. This is another initiative, which is basically a declaration of on university engagement, which is an initiative by UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, the Association of Public Land Grant Universities, and George Mason University. And what you can see, it's again a very similar declaration or commitment to the previous one. It's really a commitment to building competency, a commitment to engaging students, a commitment to creating research cross-border and cross-sector, and a commitment to basically, building capacity. We also have seen that the International Association of Universities have also started a global cluster on higher education for sustainable development. They have appointed from among the member institutions, basically a lead. So you can see from the Arab region, we have the Beirut Arab University, who's driving the lead on industry, innovation, and infrastructure. We have from the University of Tehran, for instance, who's leading the strategic goal on clear water and sanitization. And what the purpose of this coalition is, or this cluster is to basically get institutions or member institutions to work together to develop initiatives to support the 2030 agenda. So it became really on the radar of many of the international organizations and so forth. Other initiatives these are just some of them. Other initiatives is basically this network of higher education sustainability initiative launched in 2012, which basically is a network of multiple partners or multiple United Nations organization, along as communities, members of the community, and so forth. And the purpose of this is really that the network or the members of the network commit to, again, the same principles of teaching sustainability, encouraging research and dissemination in areas related to the SDGs, engaging or getting involved with green campuses to support local sustainability, and engaging, with research. So many of them share commonalities, but it's basically just the way that universities are demonstrating their commitment to sustainable development goals. There is a website where institutions are invited to actually post their case studies and what they're doing. From among the Arab universities, University in Bahrain has documented their case study, addressing very specifically SDG 4 and SDG 5. We also have seen that there are other websites that are also encouraging higher education institutions to share what they're doing in terms of sustainable development. So a case study like the one that Professor Lotfi has shared probably would be a good candidate to be on such a website. And it's really a way for universities across the globe to share their practices on how they are implementing sustainable development goals. The Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education was established in 2005. Actually, it includes today 900 universities, many of which are from North America, from the US and Canada, but they also have other members from around 20 countries. And what the association have done beyond creating a website where they can share resources and they've created a resource hub, they actually have created a benchmarking tool, which is very interesting for institutions who are embracing SDG. Their benchmarking tool allows them to compare institution sustainability performance against other peers. They've also creating a self-reporting tool where institutions can report on what they are doing against the SDGs. They've created a resource hub, but they also created a STAR system, which is actually a sustainability tracking assessment and rating system. So it's a system that rates universities against, specific criteria. You will see that there are tens of websites that have been focusing on providing resources for the higher education sector, like the University World News, PRME project, the SDG Academy, and so forth. And most recently, there have been a growing cluster for ranking frameworks focus on engagement of SDGs. So there've been a focus on ranking institution based on how much they do in relation to SDGs. Some of the oldest framework probably you would have heard of is the UI Green Matrix World University that was launched in 2010. And this really looks at, green campuses and what, universities are doing in terms of environmental sustainability. There's also the sustainability tracking and assessment ranking system, which I talked about earlier, which was launched in 2006. There is the World University Real Impact that was launched in 2021. But I think very recently we were all seeing on social media and on other means the impact ranking of Times of Higher Education. So Times of Higher Education in 2019 have created a ranking system to rank the impact of universities. It looks mainly at research, stewardship of teaching, and obviously it gives consideration to community engagement and to external leadership. And what we've seen in the 2022 ranking is that the number of institutions, because it's a voluntary kind of thing, so the number of institutions that have participated in the 2022 cycle increased by 23%, or reaching around 1,406 universities from 105 countries. And what you can see here is that many universities across the Arab region have made it into the rankings of the SDGs on individual SDG. There was one university that ranked in the top 10, which is King Abdulaziz University. They ranked number 4 on the overall achievement of SDG. They were, I think, University of St. Malaysia also was in number 4. So that the question comes in is that sustainability now is gaining a global momentum. Universities are having to embrace it. The level of maturity to which institutions have embraced SDGs is very different. We had a very good example from Egypt, but unfortunately, this is not what happens in all universities within our region. So how can we rethink higher education for sustainability? In order to think or to really embrace sustainability, we're going to have to work at 3 levels. The macro level, which is really the national dimension, the meso level, which is really the institutional dimension, what we do within our respective institution, and the micro level, which is the functional dimension. What does every individual within the context of their institution, their country, their region are doing to support the SDG. It's the faculty, in the teacher in their classroom, or the faculty in their classroom, the student club officer, for instance, in their act. So what do we do to support sustainable development goals? Now, if we thought at the national level, there are 5 imperatives that are very important. The first thing is to have a clear national strategy and agile policies that support SDGs. So we need to have a clear national educational strategy that demonstrates commitment to SDGs and leadership that help guide higher education on how to action sustainability, because not all countries will perceive SDGs the same way with the same level of importance. This includes establishing policy orientation that is enabling, flexible, and promotes autonomy. I think we've spoken a lot about autonomy this morning. It's also about looking at external quality assurance practices. And for us who are in the Arab region, external quality assurance play a key role on what we do within our institutions. How can we adapt external quality assurance standards and mechanisms so that they can value what universities are doing in relation to SDGs? So it really counts when the institution is being assessed. It also really looks at a deeper understanding. How at a national level can we gain a deeper understanding of the complexities between the economic, social, and environmental domains with specific context, and how do we encourage the adoption of a stakeholder approach that will help shaping the policy agenda and will serve the real purpose and guide the higher education providers. The governments also play a very important role in actually supporting partnerships, encouraging the formation and development of smart partnership within and across the sector, leveraging on opportunities and capabilities that are required in order to achieve SDGs. And we've seen in many countries, government play a key role in bringing in partnerships together and creating coalitions within and across the sector. And finally, we need a governing approach, developing a clear approach towards the governance to ensure that the whole government coordination approach to address SDGs is integrated, participatory, and transparent. It is transparent. So we need that so that we ensure that we can, as a nation, really contribute to the SDG. At an institutional level, very similarly, we need to have a clear institutional-wide strategy. And I like how Prof. Lutfi was talking about knowing our identity. We shouldn't all be the same. There is no one-size-fits-all. So what is basically our own institutional strategy towards SDGs? Do we have the policies and the structure to enable the implementation of that strategy? Becomes a key question. What are the tools and the approaches that we are going to be adopt for developing, implementing, measuring, reporting, and communicating on what we do in relation to the SDGs? How are we going to build capacity among different stakeholders, our students, our faculty, our alumni, our administrator, and how do we think about smart partnership? Just that as it happens at the national level, how does it happen at the level of our institutions? And finally, at the micro level, within what we're doing, every individual within our institution plays a role and contributes to the SDG. So we're basically going to look at the alignment. It's important that people are aligned, that people are speaking the same language. And, university, colleges, departments, units, individual will need to demonstrate basically their vision and their strategy towards integrating and implementing SDGs on a day-to-day basis. So cultivating that mindset to create lasting change is an important element. Engagement and commitment, demonstrating the level of engagement, how everyone who does something, it counts, and it's basically, contributing towards the realization of the goals and objectives pertinent to SDGs, and that we basically look at value co-creation, so we embrace innovation through disruptive thinking in the core functions of the institution. If we were teaching, looking at what are the most disruptive educational or pedagogical approach that we can use that will help develop the students' skills and competencies needed. And that doesn't apply just to teaching and learning, but it applies to everything that we do within our institution. I would actually highly recommend that you look at this report, Knowledge-Driven Action, Transforming Higher Education for Global Sustainability. It was just released. And what you can see here is that it echoes a lot of the things that we've talked about. It still talks about quality assurance and the role it plays in valuing what universities are doing for SDGs, looking at having proper structures in place that supports the implementation of inter and transdisciplinary research, introducing compulsory courses or whatever you decide to do within your institution to teach SDGs and so forth. So they come up with a list of, I think, 17 recommendations, and a lot of them are aligned with the things that we have mentioned earlier. I think that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Please, could you stay there, Narimane, because we have a couple of questions online. But first of all, congratulations. You shared a huge amount of information there in a lot of detail, very, very efficiently. We have a question from Jamal. What do you think of the idea that is coming up on the screen now, that said in the third world, sustainable development must go through an education system, access to the promotion of women in the rural areas and the protection of children in situations of increased poverty. In this socio-educational space, both the women and children are considered as a vulnerable social stratum, requiring specific training and supervision programs resulting from a model of sustainable human development. It's interesting, the first time we ran this forum, one of the joys of doing this is there's a huge diversity of countries which are part of the Association of Arab Universities. And at one level, we were looking at the sort of war-torn post-conflict situations, and at the other end, some very prosperous countries. And so I wanted to inject this question about the developing world. What are your thoughts?
I think that this is one of the key issues, that SDGs are broad enough, but they need to be contextualized to countries and to regions. And this is why probably research is important. Having data is important to be able to do that level of contextualization. Different countries will have different priorities. And yes, while it is important for certain countries to look at women inclusion and so forth, in other countries, they've already gone a big leap forward. So I think that this is why national strategies are important. It's nice to have that global thing, but then we need to really contextualize it at a national level and then at an institutional level as well. So I think that would be basically the most important thing, because what works, even in the Arab country, we tend to say, oh, it's the Arab world. We're very different also from one region to another, even in the Gulf region, we're very different. So I think that contextualization and understanding the implication of SDG within our context, based on research, based on data, is actually the answer.
Well, thank you for that. Now, the second question, which has come in online, is in a way a development of the question which I asked Professor Lutfi about leadership. And Samir has asked a question. I warn you, it's a very broad question. Please, what is the best way and activities to implement innovation in higher education? Now, before passing to you, if you studied Mohammed's answer to the question that I asked him about leadership, and you look at this question from that lens, it was about involvement. It was about people understanding the purpose and engaging commitment in that way. But would you like to have a go at that question as well?
I mean, it is actually a very difficult question, because again, innovation can mean different things to different people. And I always say that when, it's one of those words that we frequently use, but they're also important to be put into context. There is no magical formula around implementing innovation, to be very honest with you. It really depends on your context, on your capabilities, on your priorities as an institution. And I think having that stakeholder approach, where you really talk with different constituents and the different people on what does innovation mean? Why does it matter to us as an institution? How are we going to, what is our value proposition in terms of implementing innovation? How do we distinguish ourselves from others is really where the dialogue should start. And then the how to becomes the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's where your answer joins up with Mohammed's, really, because when I asked him that horrible leadership question, what he in effect started with was authenticity. You know who you are, know where you're working, and be real in that situation, and just sort of identify the situations there. But that's a couple of questions from online. Are there any questions or comments in the room? Well, Narimane, I think we're going to be returning to things that you have said in many different ways. I'm just being told there is a question. Is this?
Thank you very much. My name is Abdul Mohammed, and I also represent the Africa Asia Scholars Global Network. You know about the MDG, which is the Millennium Development Goals.
Yes.
We know the results. Not happy about it. We have the SDGs now. With the system, before even 2030, already even the World Bank had said it is not realizable.
Right.
You agree?
Yes, to a certain extent, yes.
Now, the universities, we tend to go to where we believe there is funds, rather than what could help develop the communities. So universities are also part of these problems. We're not building leaders. Give example, you have politicians. They're not leaders. That's why we can't get in straight. The COVID recently also shows that's why you find that we can't get the best scientists together under WHO. Rather, what happens? Countries were competing, and then they commercialized COVID. It's a sorry state. How can we see universities where we believe these intellectuals that should change society? Because even the United Nations cannot at the moment. We're asking for a vibrant United Nations. If we all believe our children should go to university, and university itself cannot, what could be the answer? You said something, and you mentioned about changing the way we teach. So if whatever ideas will come out there, we don't change. For instance, even a lot of young people have been failed even before they start school. Because if you don't memorize till today, you will fail in education. And you will never develop a structure where intellect can be quantified. So when we talk, it seems like we have old wine in a new bottle. What we said 10 years ago, we wrap it up in a different way. We just say it, and society is not getting good, it's getting worse. What in you, what do you think could be the answer? Because we are looking for the answer, we're working towards it, and we're looking for people who have the real answers to join us so that we can change the way the situation is. Because in 2018, the World Economic Forum said, and I've spoken to some people here today, they all agree with the World Economic Forum, we have a fractured world. And we wouldn't have had that if education is qualitative. So what are we talking? If we just talk and we cannot really face reality, so why are we here? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, it is a very challenging point to address. I think we all know that the Millennium Development Goal, ended, and they probably did not achieve what they were supposed to achieve. And I know that when the Sustainable Development Goal, it followed a much more inclusive approach. Now we're just less than a decade away from 2030, 8 years away from 2030. How much we've actually done of that? I mean, some people will argue we have more wars now. We have pandemics now. So we're not going forward, we're actually going backward. But what I think is important is changing that mindset. You're completely right. The most difficult thing in any change is not the systems, is not the policies, is not the strategies. It's changing what goes on in our head and the mindset and the culture. And I still believe that educators have an important role in doing that. It is true that we often go behind where the funding is, but that mindset has to change, unfortunately, because it all starts with education. That's what develops nations. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to your question in terms of whether we're going to achieve this, but we are hopeful that if we aligned ourselves and we spoke for once the same language and we've put personal interests aside, we might be able to reach to a better world.
Well, you've said the answer, but it's just practicalizing the answers. If we cannot change the institution, if you work in a university, you can't change the institution, what's the point? Now, you remember that when it came to 2013, 2 years before the UN would give us a scorecard, David Cameron, who was then the prime minister here, as well as the president of Indonesia and the president of Liberia, were called to Bali, Indonesia, by the United Nations as high-level panel. They sat down and they said what they need in 2015, renewed global partnership, people-centered policies. The UN failed us. Rather, when in 2015 came, what did the UN do? They came up with 17 goals and put partnership underneath. But nobody in the university challenged. We are still challenging it. So the answer is, if we don't challenge, and one of the reasons why we're not challenging university is because the university vice chancellors and presidents, they're looking for favors from government, either to become consultants, so they cannot challenge the system. And then we also realize that our lecturers, who are very innovative and creative in university, they become consultants to United Nations, World Bank, businesses. So they're exploiting the university. And then you have another 15% of our university lecturers who don't have that connection outside like the first 50%. So we now have 50% of our lecturers who are waiting for retirement. How can we have vibrant young people and make society a better place? The answers are here. Please, if anybody that wants the answers, connect with us. We're working towards it, and by the grace of God, we will